Hello together, and thanks to Voxel51 for having the opportunity to present my work here. Yeah, me and my colleagues Jonas, Ernst, Lukas Heuer, Jan-Erik Lenzen, and my supervisor Ben Schiele, we worked on Reconstruction improves weakly supervised semantic segmentation. And that's what I'm going to talk about the next, I think, 20 to 25 minutes. So what motivates the research we're doing? So as you're probably all pretty well aware, dense annotations for tasks like semantic segmentation are incredibly expensive to obtain if you want to have like proper pixel perfect annotations. So for instance, in the case of the cityscapes dataset, I believe they took about 2 hours per image to annotate. So if you're looking at a, let's say, recent data set, this quickly adds up to multiple thousands of hours of annotations. And obviously, depending on your use case, this might not be feasible. So then you're looking into other options, how to get a data set. And one option for this is sparse labels, on which you then perform weakly supervised semantic segmentation. So we're talking labels like these, like points, polygons, scribbles, which take orders of magnitude less annotation time for the same image to obtain. However, keep in mind, these are lower quality labels, so we need to come up with ways to compensate for the lack of supervision. So what makes this task challenging? Well, there's three major reasons that we identified. So first of all, if you have a sparse label, you don't get explicit class boundary information. Why is this important? Well, there's basically two things the model needs to learn to do proper semantic segmentation. The first is to, well, assign the right class to an object, which is still pretty straightforward with a sparse label because you have some localized information with a class label on it. And the second is to identify the boundary between classes, so between the objects in the scene. And for that, you don't have explicit supervision anymore. And that's mostly the most difficult task. So that's challenge number one. Challenge number two is depending on the quality of your labels, they might not reflect changes in object scales in your 2D image. So cars in a street scene, for instance, can be at vastly different scales. And if you're, for instance, using point labels, these labels will not reflect that, which further aggravates the difficulty. And lastly, when you train with these kind of labels, you quickly notice that a lot of methods fall back on basically what we call co-occurrence bias. So they essentially overfit on a certain prior of how scenes in this respective data set are arranged to help themselves draw these class boundaries. But depending on the scene, this will obviously create very bad results. So how was this problem addressed before our work? So basically the standard setup for this was a single image, single label pipeline entirely in 2D, and then rely on regularizations or special losses to apprehend these class boundaries I was talking about that are so critical to get right. Just to name a few examples. So for instance, we had SAS former, which was leveraging the attention maps in a classic VIT to get a further guidance signal to learn semantic segmentation. Tree energy loss was essentially relying on minimum spanning trees as a further supervisory signal. And you can always use like a vanilla mean teacher on these tasks as well. They work surprisingly well, actually. So without further ado, let's go into our own method. Here's a brief overview of the sort of idea this all came off. So basically, what if we treat such a problem not as a pure 2D problem anymore, even though our inputs and outputs are still only 2D, but we also have 3D information, and we take this problem to a 3D point cloud domain. You might ask, why would you like to do this? Well, in 3D, we have certain issues that we had in 2D. We don't have those. So for instance, if you have a point map of a scene, we don't have the scale indifference issues that we talked about for the 2D street scene, for instance, because in a properly aligned 3D point cloud, cars are just freestanding instances on a surface that is a street. So it's very easy to for a model to learn how to classify those correctly in 3D, but it's way more intricate in 2D. And basically, of this idea, we came up with a framework where we train a segmentation model both in 2D and in 3D, and then have them essentially supervise each other. So for things the 2D model is very good at, it generates pseudo labels for the 3D case and the other way around. I will go into the details of this later. This slide here is just to sort of get you accustomed to the idea before we delve into the details here. Why is this possible? Well, this pipeline basically relies on the fact that we need to be able to get a good point cloud from the input images we're dealing with. And what really helped us there is the progress we've seen in the last couple months and last 2 years, essentially, on image reconstruction. So models like VGGT, now VGGT Omega. For this work, I think we used Map Anything, which allows exactly that. Turn a sequence of images or even single images into pretty high quality point clouds that we can then leverage for the task at hand. So in terms of splitting training and inference, I just want to bring one point home. We're doing all of the 3D stuff I just talked about just to get additional supervisory signals. So this whole reconstruction and segmenting in 3D part is only necessary during training, which is great because it's quite expensive on a GPU. But the good news is that we can basically plug in any 2D segmentation model for this pipeline and then just run this at inference. So our method actually has no inference overhead in the end of the day. So let's delve a bit deeper into the pipeline. As I already said, it's a bit more than just 2 boxes and a couple arrows. So let's get started with the base architecture. So both for the 2D and the 3D semantic segmentation, we are relying on the established mean teacher approach. So you have a student network and you have a teacher network whose weights get updated through an exponentially moving average. And then you pass on strongly augmented versions of your input images to the student and less so for the teacher. And then you supervise the student firstly with a few supervised pixels we have, and also with pseudo labels from the teacher to further guide the learning of the student. We do this both in 2D and in 3D with the classic augmentation one would use in either domain. And as I already noted, this whole setup is backbone agnostic. So unlike, for instance, the SAS former work, you don't need to modify whatever network you're plugging in. So it will work both for a very small segmentation model as well as for one of the latest state-of-the-art semantic segmentation models. Now on to the interesting part and our contributions. So once we start training, we essentially start off by only having these 2 training pipelines run in parallel until they reach a certain point of quality. And then we start to apply cross-modal consistency. So essentially, the idea behind here is if we have a prediction from the teacher in 3D, let's say, it is very certain about, and we can also reasonably assume that the reconstruction of this point has been done correctly, we will use the 2D, 3D correspondences between the points in the 3D point cloud and the images to propagate this as a further pseudo label to the 2D student. And this obviously also works the other way around. Why does this work? Well, these reconstruction models have the nice property that they generate pixel-aligned point clouds. So getting these 2D, 3D correspondences is actually pretty straightforward. Keep in mind that it is important to filter both for teacher confidence and for the confidence of the 3D reconstruction method, because we found that especially wrong 3D reconstructions can mess up the training here quite severely. So speaking of the 3D point clouds, how do we do this actually? So we found what works best is to, well, take a series of images. So if you're in a self-driving scene, for instance, a couple images from a self-driving sequence and reconstruct them jointly. But now we have the issue that if you take, let's say, 20 images from Waymo or so and reconstruct them using Map Anything, you get a very large, very dense point cloud that is way too large to fit into our uh, 3D point transformer that we're using. So what we're doing is we actually subsample this point cloud, but not in a regular manner, but we make sure that 60% of the points we retain are part of the image that we're looking at with the 2D model to make sure that we have enough correspondence candidate to propagate labels from 2D to 3D and the other way around. And the further 30% that we keep are context points that help the 3D model deal on a bigger, more well-behaved scene to improve its its segmentation performance. Furthermore, the sequence approach also allows us a second thing, namely that in 3D we can actually aggregate labels. So if we have multiple images in the same scene labeled, we can use the labels from all of these image label pairs to aggregate these labels in the 3D point cloud, which essentially raises the level of supervision we get for the 3D point cloud as well, which further boosts performance a bit. At this point, I want to notice it's not completely straightforward to do this. So you need to keep a couple of things in mind when dealing with reconstructed point clouds. Namely, if you're dealing with a dynamic scene, which is especially the case when you're dealing with an outdoor scene, uh, you will see some ghosting artifacts of cars driving around. And especially if you take very long scenes, this might throw off your the 3D segmentation algorithm and lead to degraded performance. However, we found if the sequences are short enough, this seems to be no problem because the model is just able to learn that some basically line of points driving around on the street is a car as well. What is currently a bottleneck in the 2D, 3D supervision is that for these reconstruction models, they get usually very less certain with distance. So for objects that are further away, you usually don't get good correspondences because they're always filtered out. So much for the sampling strategy and the overall method. I think this is a good point to take questions if there are any. Jimmy, can you say it to me? Because I think some popped up, but I don't see them right now. Okay, it was just in the chat. Then let's move on. On to our results. So our method outperforms, in the case of weakly supervised scenarios, on all data sets that we tried on indoor, outer scenes, for point labels, for scribble labels, and for coarse labels. And also in the case of single view and image sequences. As I said, image sequences are preferable because they allow us to generate way higher quality point clouds to deal with, but it also works in the single view case, as you can see here on the left. So the diagram on the left shows you essentially a summary of most of our experiments. So on the x-axis, you see point labels, scribble labels, and coarse labels. The y-axis is the mean intersection over union. And then we evaluated this for four data sets with the labels that were available for the respective data sets. Someone's asking what WSSS stands for. That's Weakly Supervised Semantic Segmentation. So the task we're addressing here. Thanks for the question. So as you can see, especially for very sparse regimes like points, our method improves the current state of the art by quite a bit. So in a case of Kitty 360 by over 6 percentage points, and even for cityscapes by more than 3 percentage points. Same for scribbles and slightly less so for coarse. Also noting that our method especially excels in outdoor scenes. It also improves performance on NYUV2 in the indoor scene, but the advantages are slightly less pronounced than what we've seen with outdoor scenes. Some further details here. So as you can see, we also basically evaluate on another metric, which would be the ratio of what we get for this weakly supervised, sparsely supervised semantic segmentation compared to fully supervised semantic segmentation. And what is great to see here is that for the case of scribble labels on all the data sets that we evaluated, we successfully closed the performance gap to less than 10% compared to a fully supervised model. So I think it's fair to say that our method leads to results that are actually usable. Because I mean, in the end of the day, it is nice to have cheap labels, but if you can't generate a model that is usable with these cheap labels, nobody really benefits. So we're pretty proud that with our performance now, we are in the realm where you can get away with using very sparse labels and still yield a high quality segmentation algorithm. What I wanted to note here as well as a side note is maybe some of you might have already asked themselves, like, why aren't these guys using LiDAR? Most of these outdoor driving data set they evaluate on do have LiDAR. Yes, that's true. And we also evaluate on LiDAR, but what we noticed is that LiDAR scans are actually less useful and less helpful for our method than reconstruction methods. So we ran some further ablations on this, and the reason for this is twofold. First of all, reconstruction from multiple images in a sequence leads to a denser, more homogeneous point cloud. And secondly, LiDAR scans have the unfortunate property that we basically are forced to treat every signal that we have in the data set as sort of as a ground truth measurement, which is not necessarily true because also LiDAR suffers from noise. But unlike the reconstruction point clouds, we don't have a confidence metric that will tell us how likely it is that a point from the LiDAR is just noise. So that's a nice little detail on this side. Yeah, on the qualitative side, as you can see here, evaluated for our main four data sets and competing methods. Our method produces sharper and more faithful class boundaries, especially visible if you look in the first row for the pedestrian crossing the road, where other methods seem to struggle to devise a proper class boundary, whereas our method yields a very good result, even for this very complex shape of a pedestrian walking in the street. Furthermore, we get improved long-range details. So if you look in the third row here for Kitty 360, you see that the degradation of segmentation performance for objects that are closer to the vanishing point of the image, thus further away, degrades quite a bit. Whereas with our method, we can actually still predict high quality, high detailed segmentation maps even at the distance. Here are some further examples bringing this point home where we created an overlay. So if you look at these zoom ins, we have a road with cars parked by the side, and we do see that our methods produce way better aligned point clouds, plus the fact that they also don't suffer from these weird artifacts where you see that suddenly the sidewalk protrudes onto the road. So the prediction of the road suddenly changes to sidewalk, which is something that we attributed to the co-occurrence bias that you get with a lot of purely 2D methods. Moving on, we also did some ablation with respect to label quality. So what we did was we took those scribble labels and cut them down by step until they effectively became point labels to see how much the performance of our methods and competing methods is actually reliant on the quality and the size of these labels. And what we found is that the degradation over smaller scribble lengths is the least for our method, whereas most other methods degrade way stronger in their performance if you give them a smaller share of label pixels to the image. So as you can see here on the red line, our method does degrade, obviously, if you take away information from the label space, but it does way less so compared to all the other methods around. As a side note, this is not the main part of our method as a result, but maybe interesting to technically understand this paper or for people that actually want to work with LiDAR point clouds. We also looked into whether our method improves 3D segmentation as well, or is it just the 2D models that greatly benefit from this cross-modal loss. And what we found is, yes, we also improve the performance of the 3D segmentation model. So the information flow from the except pseudo labels is actually bidirectional, as you can see in these qualitative images here. So if you look at the error map of the baseline, which would be a classic mean teacher, in our method, you see that there's a significantly reduced share of wrongly labeled points in the 3D space. However, keep in mind that this is more like an analysis point, because when you have images as your input, you usually would not like to predict 3D point clouds with semantic labels as your output, in most cases at least. This is more relevant if you're actually planning on doing segmentation on LiDAR. But if you're interested in this, you might just want to do this after the talk in a Q&A session. So what are the takeaways from our method? First of all, we outperform existing methods by 2 to 7% MIU on major datasets, depending on the setting and the dataset. Secondly, we prove that 3D structure is a very powerful supervisor for 2D tasks. So geometric priors help a lot here. And lastly, reconstruction allows us to generate a very versatile pipeline. So we don't need any LiDARs for this. And we also don't have any inference overhead that is incurred by our method. You only have a certain amount of training overhead by using the 3D segmentation model as a label generator. And with that, I would like to conclude my talk and start with the Q&A.